Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming over for the panel session today for the future of underwriting, future of P&C underwriting. And we have three panelists today, all from like different areas of expertise. And we have Chris Karinka, who's the president of the Tokio Marine HCC division, and we have Vlad, who's a partner at Oliver Wyman, spent a lot of time advising a lot of carriers on the P&C underwriting transformation. We have Russell, who's the director of insurance technology for Vivint, which is a public entity, and now they're making their foray into insurance, and they're an Encore client. So firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the panel for today. So I think P&C underwriting is obviously like one of the core focus areas that we spend a lot of time on, working with a lot of carriers and the other data providers as well. So we thought it was going to be like pretty insightful to have some of our panelists share some of their thoughts about the broader trends that they're seeing in the P&C industry, as well as like some of the specific aspects on how they're thinking about like the broader transformation from an underwriting perspective. So we'll start off with some of the macro factors to begin with. Given that the current environment and the situation that's going on, would love to start from Chris, yourself, in terms of there's a lot of macro factors that's affecting the insurance industry today, particularly around the economy, the inflation, as well as like a lot of the risks around climate, as well as ESG. Would love to hear your thoughts about how Tokio Marine HCC is thinking about it, and if there's any kind of plans or like how you're approaching it over the next 12 to 18 months from that standpoint.
Yeah, perfect. So just for a quick background, I run the public risk division, and so it's a admitted package for P&C, so over 15 lines of coverage, and we're nationwide. So the first piece I'd mention would be climate change. We're seeing an increase in both severity and frequency, and if anybody's a P&C underwriter, that should not come as a surprise, certainly on the property side. And where we're seeing it, though, is not just like around coasts, but also in the Midwest, which has traditionally been a little more immune to some of the sort of the massive severity components of it, but with some of the derechos, for example, that have blown through Iowa and other places. So we're seeing a huge uptick in that, and the base rates are not really contemplating that level of activity. So that's the first piece I think that we're tackling. Secondly, where you've said about inflation is impacting the whole country. I would say that it both on a sort of non-cat basis, and then on a cat basis, it's even more severe. So sort of a non-cat, right, Midwest tradition, we're seeing undervalued buildings by 10 to 15%, but with cat exposed areas, so the Gulf, Florida, California, when there is a cat event with demand surge, that's undervalued often by 20 or 25%, just because there's not enough people to go fix what needs to be fixed in materials. So that's another piece. So where we're spending our time on that is sort of looking at TIV, or total insured value, ITV it's also called, and sort of like build it from a building and contents perspective. And so I think where Uncork is being impactful for us is we need to collect more data on our exposures than we do right now. And that's sort of the traditional, hey, like give me these 5 things about this structure and we're fine. It's not going to cut it in a new world. We need more data from a building and a contents perspective because we have a better sense of how that performs amidst some of these cat and non-cat activity. And then I think the other piece of that is, in order to differentiate ourselves and also for our own customers, it's also capturing information on like exposure mitigation measures that aren't traditionally captured by, for example, like third-party data sources. But what fire breaks do you have on some of your buildings and structures in California? What sort of levees and dams and dikes, for example, in the Midwest around riverine flooding or around the coast for storm surge? And so like the traditional models don't capture that data, and so to be able to have a tool like Uncork where it's much easier to build that, bring it into your workflow, be able to rate around it, and then do exposure management is pretty powerful. So I think these macroeconomic trends are showing us the massive need to increase our data collection and then analysis of that. And so we need a tool to be able to do that.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Chris. That's super helpful. And Vlad, and obviously you're looking at much more like a broader industry as well, right? Like you've been working with a lot of the carriers on very similar topics, like how do you address like the climate risk, and how do you think about using technology as like an enabler, right? Like to drive some of the underwriting transformation. So could you share some insights about like how different carriers are thinking about it, how they're looking to address? It's a great example from Chris, obviously, but would love to hear broader industry insights as well.
Sure. So as a quick intro, I'm Vlad Stojanovic, partner at Oliver Wyman's insurance practice, which is where we work with large carriers. I almost exclusively work on P&C side and largely on commercial side of things. And so what we're seeing carriers think about, and this is a very relevant question because we've been getting a number of them, is how do you clearly the environment is changing quickly, and environment, where you think about it from the physical environment, but you also think about who owns the risk. And I've seen many of my carrier clients are concerned about, is the traditional pathways of, insured goes to broker and the carrier underwrites, is that going to be drastically disrupted? And increasingly it is happening. It's maybe happening in places that are not so regulated, so not where Chris is, but on the E&S side. But that's been one of the huge trends recently. People using the fact that some of these disrupted or sectors from premium perspective are not finding a home with admitted carriers, or it's too expensive, and they're going to the E&S route, wholesaling it, and so carriers need to respond very rapidly. So that's not easy to do unless you have a very scalable technologies and something that you can deploy quickly. And so it's not going to be one system that underwrites hundreds of millions of exposure. You need multiple approaches to capture the niches. So it's moving from having one big machine to get a big part of the market to having many niche-oriented approaches that you can deploy in the market. So that's one thing that's very prescient, and I think you've probably seen every major carrier announce big plays there, kind of going into the E&S market, into non-regulated, chasing the new risk and all that stuff. The other thing I would say where Anchor probably helps a lot is when carriers need to think about, rethink. What I would say is like from who do we want to target and what's the primary winning paradigm there. So is it the efficiency? Is it the underwriting enablement? Is it the APIs and getting into the digital distributors? That's not how oftentimes underwriting transformation is done, but that's what we like to do it, to kind of flip it over to like go to the customer and then follow the path and let us figure out what will win it. And usually when you start thinking that way, you realize that existing tools, solutions, and what have you is not set up. It's not configured, or it's part of the solution and won't talk to the other piece. And so the whole orchestration and kind of serving the customer and the broker the way they want to be served is usually when Anchor, we have seen Anchor be helpful on that front.
Thanks, Vlad. And yeah, that's exactly some of the things that we are doing broadly in the industry as well, in terms of trying to accelerate the process for both on the P&C underwriting side as well as like enabling the distribution side of the house, for the brokers particularly to get quotes in like record time, and then try to even give them like an indication early on in the process, even before it goes through like a more detailed underwriting process, right? Like and particularly the other aspects about the technology and the climate also becomes like very pertinent when it comes to like the personal lines as well, right? Like particularly when you think about issuing like homeowners policies and like Florida and the likes, and becomes even more important to have that kind of technology to put like moratoriums in place like pretty quickly with like a click of a button and so on. So and Russell, at Vivint, you guys are actually building the full tech stack, right? Like, and then you're going greenfield, and the good thing is that you don't have like any kind of a baggage of legacy platforms. But would love to hear your thoughts about like how you're enabling some of these capabilities from a distribution angle and then the underwriting angle as well.
Yeah. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Vivint, so Vivint is a smart home home security company that is now getting into and looking to offer an embedded insurance option. And so over the last couple of years, we've been working on building out an agency to help kind of test into, okay, if our customer base is open to also trusting Vivint to help insure them in addition to securing their home. And like Rajiv mentioned, we've been working on building out for the last year our policy administration platform, which includes moratoriums, our entire rate quote buying process. And it's been one of those things where the Uncork platform has really helped us move quickly. In a couple of the earlier sessions today, it seems to be a common thread where people are able to move quickly. You're able to do it with a relatively small team. And we've seen, like you mentioned, we don't have this legacy system we have to move off of, so we're able to move that much faster. We have a relatively small team when it comes to it. We've been able to leverage some of the external partners to help accelerate things where we need to. But it's been one of those things where we're able to really push and get a lot done quickly.
Awesome. And in terms of the broader underwriting aspects itself, Chris, for example, at Tokio Marine, one part is obviously the technology aspects, which is Uncork, but there's also some of the components about being on the legacy back end, but at the same time doing a lot of work on prioritization models or analytics models, that's kind of enabling the underwriting, both from a technology and data perspective. Would love to have you elaborate a little bit more about how you're using that to enable the underwriters and to provide that kind of a level of efficiency from that standpoint.
Yeah. So we've leveraged the tool to enhance both our risk selection and our pricing, which has been pretty helpful. And so, especially from building prioritization models, so we're using business logic and rules to funnel things through our organization. And so I think the first thing that's helped us do is our underwriters are spending more time in the accounts that actually we write. And so in the past, they had to spend a lot of time going through a submission from an agent, being like, is this good or not? And so that takes some time. And now with some of the rules and the logic built in through Uncork into our workflow, we're kicking out a lot more to agents more quickly, and then having our underwriters focus on the business that actually matters for us. So we've been able to improve our hit ratio on this, and so that's for our quote to bind, that's really impactful for us. And then secondly, on our agency side, for our agents and broker partners, they're able to understand much more quickly what our appetite is and what's going to be a good fit for us, and so they can move on and focus on other things. They're not waiting something for us. So that's been really meaningful to us. And then I think the last piece is with some of the logic we've been able to build out. We basically sort of built a miniature rating sort of indication tool, so an agent can go in there and quickly, on a prospect, figure out if an account's going to be something within our appetite and not have to enter hundreds of data points to basically send it to underwriting and figure out if that's going to be something we want to write. So I think those two pieces for us are pretty impactful because it's widening our funnel at the top, and then agents are submitting more to us. But then it's also narrowing the funnel on the bottom, and then our underwriters are focusing much more on the accounts that matter, or the ones that we want to write, the ones that are going to hit, and that makes our agents super happy because they're not wasting their time sending stuff out that doesn't really fit within our appetite.
Right. And in terms of, I think that's one of the core aspects as well, right? Making sure that the underwriters are not spending a lot of time doing more manual tasks or mechanical works, but instead they are actually thinking about structuring an account and what's the right price point for this and how do I win the business, right? Particularly in this kind of a market. And Vlad, based on your experience of working with some of the clients as well, right? Prioritization model is obviously one, and then propensity to bind could be another kind of analytics models, but there's also a lot of other aspects about enriching the underwriting process through data sources, right? How are the carriers thinking about it, just broadly from a transformation perspective?
Yeah. So what I would say is that look, I think we are still early in this journey. I think the way we're using data and analytics right now is to unlock efficiency benefits. Let's get a quote out in 2-3 days versus 2 to 3 weeks. Let's answer, agent. Let's tell an agent if we will quote at all rather quickly versus holding them back. So that's the first wave, and people are in different positions on that wave. Examples Chris gave you, what we've been trying to do is in a lot of places just kind of wrestle the account away from the underwriter, so they don't get to spend too much time on it. And for a number of reasons, I've probably spent like 2,000 hours looking over underwriters' shoulders, trying to see what it is that they exactly want to do when they're underwriting. And is increasingly spend time. There's benefits to it, but then they spend too much time. There's a bit of a value being destroyed in terms of time and money, as well as finding your own biases in underwriting. So prioritization algorithms are great. Ingestion has been a big topic. It kind of removes another opportunity for underwriters to pre-underwrite before underwriting, or operations to do things before underwriting. So we've been trying to get, working with carriers to kind of get to that one and done underwriting. So let's look at account once you're really ready to look at account, and not be touch and go 3-4 times, and which extends the process. There's without a clear benefit to it. So the ingestion is a big deal. In addition to all the prioritization pieces, it is standardization of some of these. How do you answer a question on an account? And there's some budding data providers that can modify their solution to kind of fit whatever specific, like whatever question Chris wants to answer, they can send it back. So that's been helpful to kind of get the underwriters away from Google searching and all of that stuff. And then, I've seen some benefits. It's early on still of having some of this new and unstructured data pulled in. So either sentiment analysis in notes and stuff like that, or even some of the social presence data. So that's beneficial. It's early days, as I said. Not everyone is set up to do it systematically, but it's starting to happen.
And that's a very interesting point, right? Like, not everyone is kind of set up today, purely from a technology perspective. And how do you think about just going through like the underwriting transformation itself, right? If you were to think about it from a roadmap standpoint, right? Like, do you typically go like, product by product, or like by system? Like how are the carriers thinking about it, Vlad? And Chris would love to get your thoughts as well on that.
Okay. I can go for it. Sure. Look, this is very specific to what business you're in. If you're in a package business, you should not. I think it's going to be a while if you go product by product, because customer buys a package, and so you need to tackle the package from that perspective, right? So that means you might be going process step by process step instead of product by product. If you're in a specialty kind of line, then you're solving things at a product level, and you can unlock value. And if you're doing a lot of marine, you can go and tackle marine, and there's quite a bit of value to be found there. So this is what I said. You should flip it around to thinking, what does the customer want? Whether that's a direct customer, or whether it's a broker, what kind of helps meet their need, and that's the way I found it most successful in terms of prioritizing these roadmaps and so on. Chris?
I have the misfortune of being both a package and specialty package, so that's really nice. And so I think, what's interesting for us is, so I'm part of TMHEC, which broadly it's a specialty company. And so everybody who runs a different business unit says, no one's like me, right? But ultimately, we're in insurance. And so there's a submission, there's a quote, and there's a bind, right? And so there's a deep focus for us on really meeting our specific customer set's needs. So that's where a lot of our time is. But what I think is this tool has been helpful for us as we think about an enterprise perspective is that I'm still requiring to get a submission. So there is a piece of that workflow that almost every single other business unit in my company can use. And so as this proliferates, we're pretty excited about sort of like not reinventing the wheel opportunities, which is like, I still know my customer needs, but I can copy and paste from sort of the Uncork sort of code they've put together, and then stick it in where it needs to be for my business, right? And then I might have it here before an underwriter looks at it, but another one of my colleagues might put it after an underwriter looks at it. So I think like from that perspective, we see like real opportunities to I mean, it's not really scaling, right? But it's like to leverage the work that smart people have already done to then kick off my own process, right? While still diving into my specialty needs and like the truly tens of thousands of business rules and logic that I've built into our process painstakingly, but more quickly with Uncork than we ever have before.
And reusability is a great potentially like a requirement across the board, right? Like that's one of the core things that a lot of the customers are looking for in terms of like how they could leverage the platform. And Russell, that's one of the pieces that we were talking about quite a bit, right? Like, in terms of starting with something that's foundational. And the other aspect about the transformation and scaling is also like, start live or go live in one state and then think about launching it across like 50 states or so, right? Like, and there's a reusability aspect to it. How are you guys thinking about that from a scaling and transformation perspective, or on the personal lines?
Yeah, we that's actually something we're in the process right now building out with Uncork is that ability to kind of have that dynamic logic to where we can say, okay, from an underwriting perspective or from a quoting perspective or questions that we want to feed into the rater, how can we get this to where when we want to move into state number 2, 3, 4, that it's not a heavy build each time we need to do that we can do some upfront work right now, kind of build in that dynamic logic to where then when we say, okay, what's the difference between this state and this state? It's a matter of making a couple adjustments, and then we're able to move in and kind of get rolling where we don't have to go and do a ton of work to get through that.
And that's one of the like core value propositions of Uncork as well, where you can essentially kind of build these kind of foundational elements, but at the same time, you create enough reusable components, as in like then scaling up like the next products or states just becomes a lot more faster and easier at that moment as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I would like to take a pause here at this moment, and I just wanted to open up to the audience for any questions, to the panel. Any questions, thoughts in terms of like an underwriting transformation or, broadly anything that's top of mind for the group?
Yeah, so far I heard the stories around insurance, and I'm also one of the insurance companies working with Rajiv. Can you tell us some of the challenges where you wanted to do a certain way, the way underwriters are using applications in Excel, we're using MS Excel, and then when you brought it to Uncork, how did they react to the experience what they got in Uncork? Any challenges you had or anything that you want to share with us?
I can start us off. I think that I wouldn't say that Uncork brought a unique challenge to sort of the transition from Excel to a more like UI workflow-based platform. I mean, we've made other changes, and I think parts of the team that likes living in Excel still grumbled and didn't want to release that. So I think that has been consistent regardless of what application or change we've made. And so I think the piece that I think Uncork's been helpful at least is for those that want to dive into the logic, it's still easy for them to read it in Uncork, right? So I think they can still follow theoretically, right, what's happening within a process. So that's given them more comfort than, say, sort of more development or coder required piece, right? I mean, I think this is part of the reason we like it, is you kind of bring that coding level closer to the revenue generation. Mm-hmm. Like traditionally in our hard coded platforms, the underwriter tells the BA, and the BA goes and commands an army of offshore developers, and then you get back some garbage, then you got to do some more things, and it comes back, right? Because you're playing telephone. Uncork's allowed us to at least cut, for the most part, one of those legs off. So it's just BA to underwriter, and the BAs are making most of the changes and make the configurations for us. So that's made it easier in terms of to get buy-in for adopting no longer these Excel models. One of our employees that still has those locked away in a closet because she's ready for everything to break, so she can bring those back out and show us that Excel is always the way to go. But I would say it's a little easier than sort of in another development environment.
Yeah, and I would say we found something very similar. Working with some of the folks in our team, whether it was underwriting, operations, or product, the fact that we were able to bring them along in that journey, and there wasn't then that disconnect where we said, okay, now someone's going to go actually program this. They were able to be play a part in those sessions, bringing them along that journey that made all the difference with their adoption. They still definitely want to hold on to those things, but it definitely eases the pain.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm a believer in Excel, and we've been trying to pull Excel out for more than a decade, and it never goes away. Okay, so I've given up on trying to get Excel out. I think what I've seen done successfully is institutionalize Excel, make it more of a web Excel that saves data and stores it centrally, so no one has their own local copy, but it's embedded in the workflow and it's centrally controlled in terms of, what you can do to it.
I need to talk to you after this.
Okay. Yeah. So look, it's business specific. There's a lot of nuance, right? Maybe Excel is small business. I don't know. A large property rating, good luck trying to get that out of Excel. It's kind of like.
Everest, so it's a big company.
Okay. All right.
And that's one of the areas, right? Like in terms of, there's always a place for Excel and, particularly around rating and all of those things. And then what we're trying to address is like all the peripherals around it and put some kind of a structure and guardrails around it. And obviously, in terms of, putting the workflows, like all the rules and validation around it and, still use the power of Excel, right? Like from a calculation perspective. Right. Any other questions, comments from the team?
I'll make one more, just that it wasn't one part of the questions, and I think this is an undervalued component of sort of the future. But so getting underwriters is even harder now than it was 5 years ago, and the people who are poaching them are like Google and other sort of non-traditional insurance companies with stunningly beautiful compensation packages along with benefits, right, that we might not be able to offer. So that's already sort of a carrot they have. But what they're selling often now is your day-to-day experience as an underwriter will be better at this company because our technology is more interesting, it's more forward-thinking, and you don't have to do as many admin and sort of data entry tasks. And I work for a business that's been writing this for 37 years. And so what they did 20 years ago is different than today, but it's still not the same as sort of like those other people that are coming for our talent. And our talent has real relationships, right? So it's not just their skill set that we lose if they leave this industry, and specifically I'm speaking to insurance. But we found this tool has created a much higher sense of ownership among our team, and removed a lot of that administrative burden, and moved it to technology. And it's not like we've offshored it for just BPO, right, where it's someone else doing it and they get it back. And so I think we've seen a higher retention on our team because what they do on a day-to-day basis when they get up in the morning, they come into the office, well, some of them don't now, but that there's a lot more buy-in and they like what they do a lot more. And I think that's helped prevent them from taking those phone calls initially, so that now they don't even get to hear about the better compensation package. But anyways, I think that's a piece that I think is often overlooked, in that we've created a better working environment for our team that's more fun. They feel more empowered, and they feel more utilized. So I think that's pretty interesting.
That's an amazing insight because, one part is the technology, but it's always that, how does it actually affect the talent and the retention? And, at the end of the day, a happy customer, right? Like whether it's an internal underwriter or a broker or like the direct customer themselves. I think it's also a good segue in terms of just more of like closing remarks, and would love to hear you guys' thoughts about if you were to make like one prediction, for the future of underwriting for the next 18 to 24 months, or like potentially one challenge that you would foresee, right? Like what would those be from your perspective? Chris, would you like to start?
In the next 24 months, I think it's going to be probably prioritizing some of these like technology changes that are business driven, contrasting with the hardening market that we're seeing ourselves, at least in property insurance over the next 12 months. There's just this doesn't come along often, where the underwriter is the good-looking person at the dance that you want to dance with. It's the broker and the agent, right? So I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of us, is how do you take advantage of the market conditions while still pushing forward on some of these things that I think you need to do in order to perform better in a soft market.
So I'm in the business of predicting the future. So look, I'm like fully personally convinced that having a great technology environment is and not just one that you kind of install now and touch 10 years later, I think, but one that's like continually evolving, is kind of cornerstone of underwriting. It is. And it's somewhere between there not being enough labor, there being so much new technology, there being so much data, the brokers doing it, and I feel like unless you're continuously investing on the tech side, the business is going to be very challenged. And so it is sitting CIO and the head of business working together on the roadmap is like a constant thing nowadays. So it's very much a technology an underwriting environment is very much a technology environment now.
I think with the market conditions, I think what you're going to see is companies are going to start looking inward a little bit more at every dollar they're spending on technology, that they're spending on data sources that they're using for underwriting, for quoting, whatever it is. And I think we're going to have a really good explanation as to where we're spending our money. And that dollar needs to go a long ways. And as we find platforms that help us stretch that dollar to where, maybe just because we can move faster with a smaller team, those systems are going to become more and more valuable. It's going to be a lot easier to justify.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's we at Uncork also believe that the future of underwriting particularly is going to be driven by the technology, right? Like, it's not only the platform but also the data sources, the predictive models, and the analytics that something like Chris's team has built, and that becomes very imperative in terms of one of the core problems that a lot of carriers come to us is like, hey, one, we want to combine a lot of disparate data sources and then provide that kind of a unified view from a data perspective or from an underwriter perspective, but at the same time also enable underwriters to just focus on the high value tasks, right? Like, and not necessarily do the more of manual efforts and so on, right? Like, so that's where we are also spending a lot of time, and it kind of resonates a lot with some of the insights that you have shared with us as well. Unless there are any other questions from the group, happy to wrap up.
I have one more.
Yeah, go for it.
So Russell, you did mention about small teams, right? So can you share something about if your Uncork application is already in production, what does your operating model look like? Like, how often you do releases? How is a small team or big team, how do you manage it day in, day out?
Yeah, so right now we have not launched our MGA product yet, but right now we do have one dedicated system admin for our team, and then we have leveraged the Uncork team for odds and ends and for certain parts of the builds, but we've been able to stay pretty light. Our philosophy is a pretty fluid deployment process, obviously with the right checks and balances and controls in place, but we look to do weekly, if not more than weekly deployments once we're in production.
And I think, Russell, if I'm right, I think you currently have one person from Vivint, but I think probably 2 or 3 folks from an Uncork perspective.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yep.
To help you through the build process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I think thank you again for taking the time and sharing your insights. It's super helpful. Really excited to see what's coming up next in the world of underwriting. So looking forward to it. Thank you again for the time. Thanks to the panelists.